Hey, what the hell's going on, guys? It's Rocco again, and today I'm going to be bringing you guys a big ass video. But yeah, guys, thanks for coming back to the channel. And today we're going to be kicking off episode 2 of my fucking massive Genesis retrospective. And you could tell from the tone of my voice that I'm extremely excited because we're going to be talking about one of the all time progressive rock masterpieces today, the 1971 sophomore album, Nursery Cryme. And just from the title itself, and just looking at that album artwork, you know that this album is going to be a wild ride. And if you've seen the last video in the series, the Trespass review, you know how much I love that album. But this album was nonetheless a huge step forward for Genesis. I mean, their sound evolved leaps and bounds on this album, and it's just one of the most unique albums you'll ever hear in your life because it has like a certain atmosphere that Genesis would kind of like revisit on their later albums, but not to the fullest extent. I mean, this album has a very unique atmosphere in the Genesis discography. And I mean, you just look at the title, you just look at the album cover, and you know that first of all, you think like, what kind of fucking drugs were these guys doing? Because let's just address the album cover right off the bat. It's a girl from the 18th century playing croquet with fucking decapitated heads. And if you saw the album cover from Trespass, you'll know it's very quaint, very pastoral. You know, it's got wide open fields. Here you got wide open fields too, but literally littered with decapitated heads. And that's just an amazing way to describe this album. I mean, this album here is just, if I had to describe it, I would say it sounds like the Mad Hatter from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland made a fucking album. It's insane. I mean, the subject matter on all the songs is just the craziest, most whimsical, fantastical stuff you can ever come up with. And I credit that to Peter Gabriel because I think he was starting to reach his creative peak in terms of like lyricism and in terms of eccentricity on this album. I mean, this is a batshit crazy album. And according to Genesis, they never really did any drugs. So just props to them that they can come up with something so out there and so fantastic at the same time, just to create a truly unique listening experience. And I bet you're wondering, like, what happened? Like, what happened from Trespass to this album that makes it so different and so unique and so fantastic? Well, not only was it the growing confidence in Gabriel's writing and eccentricity, but also the most important factor, the final pieces in the Genesis puzzle. Phil Collins and Steve Hackett joined the band on this album. And their unique skills on their instruments just totally propelled Genesis's sound into the stratosphere, into making one of the most amazing progressive rock bands and one of their best albums of all time. And the scariest thing is, this isn't even their best album. They would continue to grow within the next 3 albums. But it's a masterpiece. It's just simply a masterpiece, and I'm just so excited to talk about it. So first, we're gonna get into a little bit of a lengthy discussion about the history behind this album, and you know how Genesis really like got together to create such a unique album in their discography, and then we'll get into the track by track reviews. So here we go. All right. So first of all, I'd just like to address the year that this album came out, 1971. I mean, what a glorious year in music. Definitely one of the greatest years in musical history. I would say from 1969 all the way till about 1974, 1975. That's where most of my favorite albums came out. And Nursery Cryme is definitely one of my favorite albums. It came out at a time when music was just, you could do anything you wanted with music. I mean, there were so many genres of music that were simultaneously popular at this point. I mean, the Beatles had broken up, and that whole like 60s flower power thing was just out the fucking window. And then you had these bands like King Crimson, Genesis, yes, coming out with their progressive rock, starting to come out with their progressive rock masterpieces. And then on the other side of things, you had hard rock just dominating with Led Zeppelin 4, Black Sabbath releasing like Master of Reality, and soon to release Volume 4, Deep Purple releasing In Rock, and Fireball. And you had this dichotomy between like this hard rock sound and this progressive experimental music. and there was so much stuff going on. You could literally do anything with music at the time. And as I mentioned, progressive rock at this point was in full swing. I mean, Yes was coming out with stuff like the Yes album, Fragile, things like that. And then King Crimson had already released 4 albums. Their classic In the Court of the Crimson King, followed by three of their lesser albums, but still very creative. And Genesis was kind of just not late to the party, but with Trespass in 1970, they hadn't really proved that they were like true progressive rock geniuses, because the sound of that album was just very laid back, very folk influenced, except for The Knife, as we've discussed before. But it didn't really bring a whole lot of like innovation to the sound of progressive rock. And this is where Nursery Cryme comes in, because this album sounds like nothing else in the progressive rock genre. And that's what I love about progressive rock. It's a genre of music, but in the name of the genre itself, it literally gives you the freedom to do whatever you want. So no two progressive rock bands sound the same. I mean, if you listen to something like Vandergraaf Generator, then if you listen to Genesis, and then Yes, none of those bands sound remotely similar, but they're all driven by that guiding spirit of discovery and just throwing caution to the wind and doing whatever the fuck they wanted. And even Pink Floyd, for that matter, like they were just insane at this time, like releasing metal and things like Echoes and Atom Heart Mother, like they were off the chain. But anyway, so 1970 was a pretty decent year for Genesis. They had released Trespass, they were gaining momentum, and they started touring more frequently, mostly in southern Europe. Really like welcomed Genesis with open arms. I mentioned Italy in the last video, and the Italians were huge Genesis fans. So Genesis were kind of like touring around in Italy, and Anthony Phillips, their lead guitar player at the time, and one of the main driving forces behind the sound of Trespass, he wasn't enjoying the fame. Like he wasn't liking the stage fright and playing on stage. And don't get me wrong, Genesis weren't like a huge band at the time by any means, but I guess their growing popularity, although it was just they didn't grow like leaps and bounds, but they grew a little bit in popularity. Just kind of got to Anthony Phillips, and he decided to leave the band. And at this point, the band consisted of Anthony Phillips on guitar, Peter Gabriel on vocals and flute, Mike Rutherford on bass and acoustic guitar, Tony Banks on keyboards, and John Mayhew on drums. And at this point, as I mentioned, Anthony Phillips was the main driving force behind their folk-inspired sound, and him leaving the band was just a major blow. I mean, Tony Banks was thinking like, "That's it. Like, we're gonna disband," because Anthony Phillips was such an important part of the sound, and they were gonna throw in the towel, because at that time, Mike Rutherford and Anthony Phillips were really driving the band with those 12-string guitars, and then Tony Banks and Peter Gabriel were coming up with more of like the quirky progressive stuff. But yeah, it was they were gonna throw in the towel, and thank God they didn't, because if Genesis threw in the towel after Trespass, just think about all the classic masterpieces we wouldn't have gotten. No Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, no Foxtrot, no Selling England by the Pound. Music would just be such a shittier place, in my opinion. So thank God they decided to have a meeting and soldiered on as a 4-piece band. That's right. They're like, you know what? We're not going to even attempt to hire a new guitar player. Tony Banks basically laid it down on the line and said, okay, guys, if we're going to continue this way, we're not going to compromise at all. We need a band full of strong songwriters. And the unfortunate thing was, John Mayhew, the drummer at the time, he was not a strong songwriter. He kind of just basically did what the band told him to do. And nothing against the guy. He was a good drummer. But just compared to the other band members, he wasn't pulling his own weight. I mean, he was even from a different background. Like all the other Genesis members came from Charterhouse. He was more from like a middle class, like working class background. And he was kind of shy. He didn't really have the balls to step forward and really express himself on the drum kit. And you could kind of hear that in Trespass, but I still think he did a pretty good job on that album. So anyway, they laid it down on the line. They said, okay, sorry, man, you're out of the band. And they went on a quest for a new drummer to continue as a 4-piece. So they were holding auditions, and a young man named Phil Collins at the time, he was in a band called the Flaming Youth, and he always saw ads for Genesis in the Melody Maker, that these damn, like, these guys were always getting gigs, they were always working, always soldiering on. And he's like, he kind of felt kind of stagnant in the band he was in at the time. So him and his guitar player, they went to audition at Peter Gabriel's parents' house for the new position in Genesis. So Phil Collins was there. He was excited, and he was a smart fucker. What he did was he actually like laid back and like kind of listened in on the other drummers auditioning, kind of like wanting to hear what Genesis was all about before he approached the kit. And I find this story hilarious. He was actually just swimming in Peter Gabriel's parents' swimming pool, just kind of like listening in on the sessions, kind of taking in Trespass. He didn't like research the band before, and he kind of just listened to the other drummers and what the band was looking for and what they weren't looking for. And by the time it was his turn for the audition, he fucking killed it. Okay, it wasn't only because he was cheating. It's also because Phil Collins is honestly one of the greatest drummers of all time. In the early 70s, he was up there with the greats. Bill Bruford, Carl Palmer, all the great progressive rock drummers. Phil Collins was right at the top, and he fucking knew it. Peter Gabriel actually came from a drumming background, and when he saw Phil Collins, just the way he sat in the drum kit, he knew that this was the guy. But not only that, Phil Collins, he had such enthusiasm. He was hilarious. He kind of just gelled with the band personality wise, and they just loved his sense of humor. So they basically hired him on the spot. Unfortunately, his Flaming Youth guitarist didn't make the cut, but they were dead set on being a four piece anyway, so it didn't really matter. So Phil Collins was in the band, and it was great because not only was Phil Collins a strong drummer, he was also a really great singer. And like, it was perfect because Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford weren't the greatest at backing vocals. I mean, if you listen to some of the stuff off Trespass, like Visions of Angels and Dusk, like, you'll hear some nice backup vocals, but nothing really to write home about. But Phil Collins, on the other hand, his voice just meshed so well with Peter Gabriel's. I mean, to this day, it's just astounding how similar their voices are to each other, and that really throws off a lot of fans. Like, when Phil Collins would later replace Gabriel as lead singer, a lot of people didn't even notice. I definitely noticed because they do have different voices. Phil Collins is definitely more on the higher register, less of a quirky tone in his voice. I guess you could say he's more of a clean singer than Peter Gabriel. But still, when they're singing together, it's extremely hard to differentiate their voices. And they really use that to their full potential on Nursery Cryme. Like, they're singing together pretty much on like most of the songs on this album, and it just gives it an extra layer of depth. So they found Phil Collins. He was just so enthusiastic, so hardworking. He would always be the first one to show up for rehearsals and gigs and things like that. So they found the perfect drummer. And I honestly think Phil Collins, yeah, definitely one of the best drummers of the 70s, and definitely one of the main reasons why Genesis really like picked up the pace with Nursery Cryme. Like, they utilized Phil to his full potential on this album. But we'll get more into that later. So anyway, Phil Collins is in the band, and they're playing gigs as a four piece. And the really interesting thing was, I bet you're wondering, like, how the hell did they get this lead guitar sound if they didn't hire a new guitar player? Well, believe it or not, Tony Banks, the keyboard player, was actually playing two keyboards simultaneously. One was, for the usual keyboard sound, and the other he ran through a fucking fuzz box to get a lead guitar sound. And that's how the band played. They actually went on tour like that, with Tony Banks playing two keyboards at the same time. And to this day, he credits that as like a real turning point in his playing, where he became a good where he went from being a good keyboard player into being a master behind the keyboards. I mean, Tony Banks is like, I honestly consider him like one of the greatest musical geniuses of all time, and probably the one member that you could never take away from Genesis without maintaining that like classic Genesis sound. I mean, he's just, honestly, I consider him the mastermind behind Genesis. Sure, if the other members weren't in the band, it would be nowhere near as good. But I still think Tony Banks provided that core sound. And all that time grinding, playing the two keyboards at the same time, really made him into like a virtuoso. So I found that really interesting. And speaking of virtuosos, Phil Collins himself is one of the main reasons how Genesis really developed instrumentally. I mean, if you listen to Trespass, you'll notice there aren't really like many flashy or technical moments of like musical prowess on that album. Like, not to take anything away from it, but you never really hear like what Yes were doing, what King Crimson were doing with all these intricate musical passages. And I just like to preface this by saying that, like, I don't care how complex a musical passage is. All I care about is songwriting. But like, once when you incorporate those complex time signatures and those like crazy changes and everything into a song, and it benefits the song, then you're really like diving into the magic there. I mean, that's just fantastic when done right. And Phil Collins at the time was a big Yes fan. He was trying to bring a lot of like virtuosity into his playing, and I think he really inspired the rest of the band to like pick it up and like really like pick up the chops. And just another reason why Phil Collins was such a huge addition to Genesis. So anyway, they continued as a four-piece for a little bit, and they were developing songs which would later appear on Nursery Cryme, such as the massive musical box, which was actually written when Anthony Phillips was still in the band, but they were really like developing it and expanding it on tour, and they noticed that like it did sound good as a four-piece, but there were other tracks they were trying out where like they really felt like they needed some guitar in there. So upon a friend's recommendation, they decided to hire this player Mick Bernard, who joined them on tour for about 2 months. And he was okay, and like he really contributed to the middle sections of the musical box, which honestly is like it's good enough for me because he was only in the band for 2 months. And then they let him go because they found that his expertise wasn't up to par. And yeah, so now they were set on finding a new guitar. So they were auditioning guitar players, and like they couldn't seem to catch a break. I mean, they kept noticing they had two different kinds of people wanting to audition for them. Either a big, flashy lead guitar player, like a Jimmy Page or a Richie Blackmore kind of type, or they would find like really laid back, folk inspired, kind of like just wanted to be in the background, like making like pretty little folk tunes and things like that. And they could never find like a real combination of both those worlds. And as you could tell from Trespass, they weren't just interested in the folk inspired shit. They wanted to get heavy, like from the knife, and they wanted to perfectly combine that. Rather than writing one folk song and one heavy song, they wanted to meld that into one unified piece of work. And they couldn't do that with a guitar player like that who couldn't really think outside the box. But then one day, Peter Gabriel struck some fucking gold when he found had in the melody maker for a dude named Steve Hackett. And basically, Steve Hackett's ad really caught Peter Gabriel's attention. And props to him because just look at the balls on this guy. Look what it said in his ad. It said, "Imaginative guitarist slash writer seeks involvement with receptive musicians determined to drive beyond existing stagnant music forms." I mean, if that doesn't catch your attention, I don't know what will. And the fact that people were writing things like this in their early 20s, I mean, I should mention this. None of the members of Genesis were older than 22 years old at the time. And just to think back, I'm 23 right now, so it's just incredible to think that someone at such a young age could just write such profound music. Anyway, I don't want to get into a rant right now, but Peter Gabriel spotted that in the Melody Maker, and they met Steve Hackett, and they just, oh my god, they just totally gelled as a band. He was the perfect fit of what they were looking for. He was willing to basically do anything, play heavy, play light, but it wasn't just about the lightness and the heaviness of his playing. It was also his technique. He was such a unique guitar player, and he really, before Genesis, he was really obscure. Like, he wasn't really in many famous bands. Same with Phil Collins, but like when Steve Hackett joined Genesis, it was the perfect outlet to express his creativity because not only was he a writer, but his guitar playing technique is just ridiculous. So they immediately hired Steve Hackett, and and they started developing their new album, which would end up being Nursery Cryme. And I just have to go on a little bit of a rant about Steve Hackett because he's just definitely one of my favorite progressive rock guitarists. And if you watch my one of my other YouTube videos, it's a review of his most recent album, At the Edge of Light, and I go into a lengthy explanation of why he's such a fantastic guitar player. And I'll kind of abbreviate that for this video. But basically, it comes down to two things. First of all, he's classically inspired, so he throws a lot of classical influence into his playing. Number two, his playing is just so unique because he plays the guitar and kind of makes it sound like a violin, kind of like what Robert Fripp was doing with In the Court of the Crimson King and subsequent albums. But Steve Hackett, as I mentioned in that other video, he makes it melodic. He makes it really, really easy to listen to. Whereas Robert Fripp was more on the atonal side, more on the experimental side. So Steve Hackett's violin-like guitar playing really brings like a melancholic nature to the sound of Genesis, and really gives it a classical like 18th 17th century kind of feel to the music, which was just unlike anything else that was coming out at the time. And number three, the guy fucking invented the finger tapping technique. I mean, sure, maybe he like picked it up from somewhere, but he was the first one to actually like develop the sound and really bring it forward as like like a valid way of playing the guitar. And the finger tapping technique is just all over this album. I mean, out of all the Genesis albums, this is the one where he just really made use of that technique, which would later inspire bands like Van Halen, obviously, Randy Rhoads' guitar playing with Ozzy Osbourne, not to mention a lot of like the heavy metal bands that would come out from England, like Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, people like that. Well, I don't know about Judas Priest, but definitely Iron Maiden was influenced by Steve Hackett. And now here we had it. We had the full Genesis lineup of Peter Gabriel, Mike Rutherford, Tony Banks, and the two new guys, Phil Collins and Steve Hackett. And this lineup was unique among a lot of the bands back then because all five members of the band were very strong songwriters. There wasn't one member of the band that was really like leading them with the songwriting. Like for example, you look at bands like Led Zeppelin. Robert Plant and Jimmy Page were doing like 90% of the work with the songwriting. You look at the Rolling Stones, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, the Beatles, McCartney and Lennon. It's like there was a strong pattern at the time where you had a band and there would only be like one or two leaders of the band writing most of the songs. But Genesis wasn't like that. Each of the five members was an extremely strong songwriter. And at times they often clashed because they all had very strong opinions on how things should have sounded. And Phil Collins explains this in one of the Genesis interviews where he's saying he just wanted to get shit done. Like he'd show up ready to go, and then all of a sudden he'd be like, "Oh, where the fuck's Tony Banks?" And then someone would be like, "Oh, they had like an argument, and he like stormed out." And it pissed off Phil Collins because he just wanted to get shit done. He just wanted to, allow the band to gel together. But I think that like all great works of art, it takes a lot of turmoil and chaos to brew these masterpieces. Because if you think about it, having four other guys in the band criticizing your idea is really a form of quality control. I mean, look at it this way. You look at bands where like there's a sole leader and they come out with an idea, maybe it's not the best idea. But no one has the balls to stand up against them and say, "Hey, like maybe you should go back to the drawing board and rework this." But in Genesis, you had four guys to put some quality control on your ideas. And the band was really a set of five equals at this point. Like you think of bands like, for example, Metallica is a really good example, where after Cliff Burton passed away, they picked up Jason Newsted on the bass. And they purposefully suppressed the sound of his playing on that album and Justice for All, kind of like as a hazing experiment. Here in Genesis, you hear Phil Collins and Steve Hackett full force on this album, and they literally dominate the sound. So just from day one, Genesis was a group of equals, and really they had an amazing relationship where they had quality control measures put in place. Now later on in their career, in like the mid '70s, the quality control I'm talking about that early on acted to shape the band into creating masterpieces, kind of suppressed the creativity of a few members as a few of the other members rose to prominence. And who I'm talking about is basically Steve Hackett leaving the band in 1977 because he felt that his creativity was being suppressed. So originally, that quality control kind of started off as a good thing, but then kind of turned into a bad thing. But that's a story for another video. So I just like to conclude this historical segment on the album by just talking about a musical instrument I love, a little instrument called the mellotron. Now, on Trespass, you'll hear a little bit of Mellotron here and there, not too much, and it adds, like, a little bit of texture to the sound. But on Nursery Cryme, you're going to notice the Mellotron is a very prominent instrument. And I just got to give Steve Hackett the credit for this, because when he joined Genesis, not only did he add his unique touch on the guitar, but he told Tony Banks, "Come on, band, buy a fucking nice Mellotron," because the one they had at the time, I guess, it was small and underpowered. So Tony Banks, he ended up buying a Mellotron from King Crimson themselves, who were known to feature the Mellotron in their early albums. And I really got to give Steve Hackett the credit, because maybe if he didn't suggest this to Tony Banks, the album would have sounded a lot different. And we all know how amazing Tony Banks was on the Mellotron. So just kudos to Steve Hackett, because without him, this album could have sounded drastically different. Now, speaking about the sound of this album, what sets it apart? What makes it such the great step forward that most fans claim it is? Because if you recall earlier in the video, I mentioned that a lot of people consider this a great big leaps and bounds step ahead for Genesis compared to Trespass. And if you watch my Trespass review, you know I love that album. It's a great fucking album. And a lot of people use Nursery Cryme as a way to kind of shit on Trespass by saying, "Oh, look how much better Nursery Cryme is than Trespass." Like they weren't ready yet at that time. They weren't producing that sound. But you got to look at Trespass kind of like an isolation. It was a different lineup, and you got to appreciate it for what it was. And it did really sow the seeds for albums to come, like this and the next one after. But really, what is it about this album that makes it so different from Trespass? Well, obviously, as we spoke about before, we have two extra songwriters in the band, basically like a fresh new lineup, and the band was touring, so they were really progressing their sound. So, what is the general atmosphere of this album? Man, if I can describe it in a few words, it's Victorian England on an album. I mean, that's the amazing thing about Genesis. Their music was not derivative of the blues of America, like a lot of the original rock bands coming out from England. Even like the things like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and like bands like that were big in the 60s were heavily derivative from English blues, sorry, from American blues and American rock and roll. But not Genesis. I mean, these guys had a totally unique sound that really didn't derive from anything. Like they came up with it on their own. And it's a truly unique European listening experience. And that's why I think a lot of the Southern European countries were very receptive to Genesis. Because I don't think that the American rock and roll and the American blues had hit those parts of Europe before England. So at that time, they were open for anything. And Genesis was ready to deliver. So yeah, as Peter Gabriel himself states, the atmosphere he was going with on this album, both lyrically and musically, was Victorian England. And what does that mean? How does something sound like Victorian England? Well, the way he describes it is that it was a society that just seemed so uptight and so regulated, so perfect on the surface, but underneath there was so much suppressed sex and violence and fucking the 19th century equivalent of rock and roll going on. And it was just such a dirty and disturbing society underneath the surface. And that's what they tried to convey with this album. So lyrically speaking, all the songs kind of dabble in that period, but it's not a period piece. I mean, the lyrics of this album are fantastical beyond belief. I mean, the shit that goes down in these songs could only come out of a mad genius's mind, and that being Peter Gabriel for the most part. I mean, some of the songs on this album, actually all of the songs on this album, just deal with insane, whimsical, fantasy-inspired things. Now you'll notice that in the Trespass review, I mentioned that that album was also heavy on fantasy lyrics, but there's a big difference. On that album, it kind of sounded like they were kind of taking themselves kind of seriously with the lyrics. On this album, they're just going batshit crazy with all kinds of just insane scenarios. Honestly, like this song goes from children killing themselves with croquet, mallets, and ghosts with suppressed sexual desires, fucking giant plants taking over the world. Oh my god, suicidal restaurant owners, the first hermaphrodite. It's just insane, you know. And you could tell that they were just really letting their imaginations run wild. Not like on Trespass where it was more tame and like the fantasy inspired lyrics were more commonplace, more derivative of other fairy tales and other myths. But on this album, they're just going nuts. And Peter Gabriel's vocals definitely took a giant step forward. I mean, on Trespass, he sounds great, but on that album, he was more using his soul inspired vocals. On this album, when the song goes batshit crazy, he sounds batshit crazy. I mean, he alters his voice to fit the mood of the song like a fucking chameleon. And at first, that can be a little bit hard to get into, but as time goes by and you really listen to it, you fall head over heels because Peter Gabriel is such an emotive, such a quirky, and such an expressive singer. And when you're singing about fucking giant hogweeds taking over the world, there's no way you could sing that with a laid back, soulful tone. You got to amp it up a bit. You got to put some balls into your vocals. And that's just what he did. He just changed his vocal style to fit the song and added a lot of quirk and charisma to it, which is amazing. So if anything improved leaps and bounds from Trespass, it was definitely Peter Gabriel's vocals. And just the atmosphere, as I mentioned before, is totally different from Trespass. On here, you have a lot of heavy moments to contrast with the acoustic moments. You still have the acoustic, and you still have the romantic sections, especially with the Mellotron. But you also have some heavy ass fucking balls to the wall sections, like you would find in the Knife, but interspersed within the songs. Like they're not. It's not like on Trespass where you get one acoustic song and then you get the Knife where it's just balls to the wall hard rock. No, on this album they perfectly interwove the heaviness into each of the songs, creating a truly progressive sounding listening experience. So yeah, lyrically, I love this album. It's just so eccentric and not a lot of people like that. Like some people like lyrics to really reflect society, make all kinds of like social commentary, kind of like the human condition, things like that. And don't get me wrong, I love that too, but I need some contrast. Like I love a good band like like Pink Floyd, like Vandergraaf Generator, that really touch upon the human condition in an extremely meaningful way. Things like like even the singer songwriters like Neil Young and Bob Dylan, people like that. That's fantastic. But then sometimes you just need a fantasy lyric, really to let your imagination run wild. And that's when I go to Genesis, especially the early years, because their lyrics were just insane. And I just got to mention the album cover again. It was designed by the same dude who came up with the Trespass album cover, Paul Whitehead, and he did a fantastic job on this. I mean, you look at this album cover as you listen to the music, and it's just a perfect reflection of the craziness of the lyrical content of this album. Definitely my favorite Genesis album cover, and the next one he would design on Foxtrot, it gives it a run for its money, but I say I still like this one a lot better. So yeah, Nursery Cryme is just a work of art, and its atmosphere is unlike any other album. Now let's talk about the songs because the song structures and the songs on this album are definitely a lot different from on Trespass. On Because on Trespass, like you had some epic length songs, like I mentioned, Stagnation, Looking for Someone, which were fantastic. They were great epics, and they went through a lot of changes. But oh my god, guys, the transitions within the songs on this album put the ones on Trespass to shame because they're so seamless, and it just seems like the band has just a lot more musical chops. Well, first of all, you got Phil Collins on drums, just all over the place. He is going full force on this album with his intricate and complex time signatures and all that shit. And then you got Tony Banks, whose keyboard playing just really, really expanded, especially when he was playing the two keyboards at once. That really allowed him to improve his skills as a virtuoso keyboard player. And it just seems like a way more progressive album. Like there's so many transitions within the songs that take you by surprise, but in a good way. Like these transitions are seamless. They're not like I feel like these days there's so many progressive metal and progressive rock bands that just change they just put all these time changes in just for the fuck of it, and they don't serve the song. But on songs on Nursery Cryme and other Genesis albums, that on other progressive rock albums in general from this era, the time changes really suited the songs, and they put they added so much to the complexity of the song. So, three songs on this album are the epics. We got the musical box, the Return of the Giant Hogweed, and the closing track, The Fountain of Salmacis. And all three of these songs just perfectly demonstrate what I'm talking about. I mean, if you listen to them, they never stay in the same spot more than like a minute, I'd say at most. Like they're always constantly changing, and definitely in the best possible way. And then you have like a lot of shorter songs just peppered throughout, just to give some padding between like the larger epics. And these songs also have an amazing charm on their own. And we'll get into that with the track by track reviews. But the song structures are definitely, definitely improved over Trespass. And there's a lot more musical chops on this album. And the sound is just totally, I mentioned this a million times, but the fucking Mellotron just gives this album just another layer of complexity, as well as Steve Hackett's expressive and emotive guitar playing. I mean, oh man, this guy here, he knows when to play and when to shut up. Like he knows when to go into the background and just let the other instruments take over. But when he goes hard, when he goes full force, it's just a moment to behold. Like it's just incredible. And that's what I love about this album. Like the restraint that Steve Hackett shows is just crazy. They found the perfect guitar player that they needed to really let the music breathe and expand. And I guess the only thing left to talk about would be Phil Collins. Phil Collins on this album. We talked about his drumming already. It's incredible. But his vocals are just amazing. Like again, he's singing together with Peter Gabriel on a lot of the songs on this album, and it just provides this awesome bedrock for Peter Gabriel's voice to kind of like to lead, because it provides that nice upper register vocal tone that you need, and it's a great contrast to Peter Gabriel's deeper, more soulful vocals on the album. So yeah, Phil's backing vocals are just fucking awesome on this album. And he also sings his own solo piece, which is great because it just goes to show that the band welcomed him with open arms, and that's just something I love about Genesis. They really let these guys shine on the album. So in conclusion, what are you going to get with this album? Well, you're going to get an album that is really, really quirky, relies on a Victorian atmosphere filled with fantasy inspired lyrics, crazy vocals to match, and just adventurous and imaginative musical passages. Just filled with Mellotron soaked keyboard solos, insanely precise drumming by Phil Collins, amazing, oh man, awesome finger tapping and heavy ass solos by Steve Hackett thrown within, and just an amazing overall contrast between laid back acoustic sections and bombastic, heavy, progressive changes, all within the same songs. So, and just the overall sense that you're listening to one of the most unique albums of all time. So it's definitely a masterpiece and probably in the top five Genesis albums of all time. But give it a run for its money. So now we're going to get into the track by track discussions for the hardcore fans to talk about what are the building blocks of this album that make it so fantastic. So let's dive in.
I've been waiting here for so long, and all this time that passed me by, it doesn't seem to matter now. You stand there with your fixed expression, casting doubt on all I have to say. Why don't you touch me? Touch me. Why don't you?
Kicking off the album, we got the musical box. And oh my god, let me tell you guys, this song is a fucking masterpiece. Not only is this song one of the greatest Genesis songs of all time, my second favorite to be exact, but it's one of the greatest songs ever written, in my opinion. I mean, this song here literally packs in everything that makes Genesis great into one 10.5 minute song. And to start off an album with a 10.5 minute song when you aren't like a big popular band took a lot of fucking balls. And Peter Gabriel was the one to say it. They wanted to prove to the world that they had some big brass balls on this album, and they gave no shits. I mean, this song here, to this day, I still consider this although it's not my number one favorite Genesis song, I really think that this one is like probably the most representative of their sound. It's got like a little bit of everything in it, and it's the perfect song to start off with when listening to Genesis. So I'd recommend if you're just starting to get into Genesis, this is the song to start off with because it's just musical perfection and it's not as overwhelming as a certain song on their next album, which I consider my favorite of all time, along with many other fans. But yeah, this one here or Firth of Fifth on Selling England by the Pound are probably going to be the ones you're going to want to start with because they're just classic. And I mean, this song here just solidifies everything that makes this album great. The lyrics are eccentric. The music has constant time changes. It never stays in one place. It's atmospheric. It's disturbing. It's got some of the most passionate vocals you can ever hear, pretty much. And the song itself is just, oh man. We'll start off talking about the lyrics. So this song has to have one of the most creative and convoluted storylines of any Genesis song. So basically, it's about two little kids, a boy and a girl, playing croquet in Victorian England. And for some reason, they leave it up to your interpretation. The girl decapitates the guy with the croquet mallet somehow. I don't know the physics behind that, but who gives a shit? And then all of a sudden, the boy's spirit gets trapped into this musical box in the girl's home. And then one day, I guess years go by, and she opens up the musical box and starts playing it, and the boy's spirit is released. But he isn't a boy anymore. His spirit aged in the musical box, and now he's a dirty old man looking for some sex, basically. Again, Peter Gabriel is trying to get across that suppressed sexuality in Victorian times, where you had like a uptight society, but underneath there was this unspoken sexual desire, and he was really trying to represent that with this song. So anyway, the ghost of the boy tries to rape the girl Cynthia, but just before he's able to do that, the nurse comes in and destroys the musical box, ending the story. And the band actually went to great lengths to explain this story. Uh, in the liner notes, there's actually a little paragraph before the song because from the lyrics of the song themselves, you wouldn't be able to piece together this story because they kind of like jump all over the place. But it's just insane, and that's basically the inspiration for the album cover. So you have with a storyline like that, how can you go wrong? It's quirky, it's eccentric. It's basically what this album's all about. Now, musically, here's where the song gets really complex. And I feel like I'm not going to be doing it justice by explaining it with words. So really, just go and listen to this song before proceeding with this review because it's just a must-hear progressive song and a milestone in the genre. So how does this song start off? It starts off, nice and laid back. Some great flute playing by Peter Gabriel. These amazing, passionate vocals with this sense of longing in them and this amazing jangly guitar intro, which was, I think, developed by Anthony Phillips before he left the band. Yeah, Anthony Phillips and Mike Rutherford developed it. And at first, I guess coming off of Trespass, if you were a fan of Trespass back then, this wouldn't have seemed that much different from Trespass. Definitely has more passionate vocals, definitely has like a darker, more melancholic feel with the flute and the keyboard in the background. But overall, it's not too different. And this goes on for about 3.5 minutes. And honestly, like to this day, it's one of my favorite moments in Genesis's career. It's just so, oh man, it's just so atmospheric, and the longing in Gabriel's voice is just so passionate. And then when they were writing this song, Steve Hackett realized, hold on a second here, guys. We're writing a song about a fucking musical box, and yet there's nothing that really represents the sound of a musical box. So he added this little tune on the guitar here every now and then, where it's like ding 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 to represent the sound of the musical box. And I think that was just the perfect touch to add to the first 3 minutes of this song. Not to mention you got Phil Collins' amazing backup vocals with the "Here It Goes Again" part, and it's just an amazing contrast to Peter Gabriel. But so far it's a pretty standard Genesis song, kind of like from the Trespass era. And then before you know it, this thunderous riff comes in. Bow now, bow now, down now, and then the keyboards. Down now, and the drumming kicks in full force, and then all of a sudden it sounds like literally like you're listening to a metal song. And Peter Gabriel wanted to put this section in because he was listening to a lot of the Who at the time, and he wanted to put some balls into their music. So just a totally unexpected time change, but honestly, a flawless transition from that smoky atmospheric intro. And Steve Hackett's just going nuts. He's all over the place. He's wailing on the guitar using his classic finger tapping technique, and it's just one of the craziest and most heaviest sections in any Genesis song. And then before you know it, it kicks back into the laid back section with Peter Gabriel singing all these nursery crimes, like nursery rhymes like Old King Cole and things like that. And before you know it, we're back into the heavy section. And this section just gallops along at such an incredible pace. You can really see how Iron Maiden derived a lot of inspiration from this song, because this part of the song just gallops along, and then Steve Hackett's guitar kicks in again, and oh man, it's hard to describe with words, but it's just so incredible. But then what really solidifies this song is one of Genesis's best. It was already a masterpiece, but then at around like the 7-8 minute mark, this amazing buildup comes in with Phil Collins' drums just slowly getting louder and louder and louder, and Peter Gabriel's voice is building and building and building. And honestly, like, the emotions you feel when you hear this are second to none. And then before you know it, the crescendo comes in, and Peter Gabriel's just shouting, "Why don't you touch me, touch me?" I guess representing the ghost sexual desires, and it ends in this incredible climax that you can only hear to believe. So, in conclusion, the musical box, it's an epic song clocking in at 10.5 minutes, one of Genesis's best by far. So, listen to it right now, and it obviously gets a 10 out of 10, a very strong 10 out of 10 for me.
Leaving tuppence on the plate, they hurry down the path and through the gate and wait to board the bus that ambles down the street.
Now, next, coming up on the album, we got the nice short acoustic ballad For Absent Friends, actually written by Phil Collins and Steve Hackett, the two new guys. I guess they wanted to show the band what they can do, so they wrote this nice, beautiful acoustic ballad. And this is honestly the perfect come down from the epicness that is the musical box. And it's nice because it's sandwiched between two of the long ass songs on the album, musical box, and then after this one we got the Return of the Giant Hogweed, and it's just the perfect palate cleanser for your ears to just refresh themselves before diving right back into the insanity. And I really feel that this is an extremely underrated song because I consider it more than just a 1.5 minute acoustic ballad. For one reason alone, Phil Collins' amazing vocals on this song. I mean, uh, there's some parts where the song builds up to this like incredible, I guess not a crescendo, this incredible emotional climax. You'll hear it in like the section before this, before me talking in the clip I played. But his vocals on that song, on that part of the song, just they give me goosebumps every time. And thematically and lyrically, it's just about again Victorian England, kind of showing like the religious themes back then, with like the old couples going to church and like thinking about all their friends that passed away over the years. And it's just a beautiful little song, very underrated and perfectly placed on the album. So I'm gonna give this one a good 8 out of 10.
Turn and run, nothing could stop them. All around every
Yeah, track 3, The Return of the Giant Hogweed. Another long ass track, clocking it at 8 minutes. And man, I really love this song. This song here just really exemplifies the eccentricity of this album. I mean, it's totally bonkers. The storyline itself, if you thought the musical box was crazy, okay, you know what? It is just as crazy as the musical box, but it tells of the apocalypse, but not just any apocalypse. An apocalypse brought on by giant fucking plants. That's right. The song's about a Victorian Russian explorer bringing back this plant called the giant hogweed, which quickly grows, overruns the English countryside, and literally takes over the world. And the music of this song really fits well into that apocalyptic theme. And later on, Genesis would revisit the apocalypse on their classic song "Supper's Ready," but this was the first song that really did it. Unless you count Stagnation, but I consider that more of like a post-apocalyptic song. This song, you're right in the heat of the moment, right in, like Genesis takes you right throughout the apocalypse, and it's a fantastic song. And this song must have came as a pretty big shock at the time because it's totally different from anything off Trespass. Gone is any romanticism from this song. This song is just straight to the point, harsh, in your face, British eccentric craziness. And Peter Gabriel's voice really reflects the apocalyptic nature. I mean, he's singing with all he's got. He's putting a lot of crunch, a lot of harshness into his vocals, and that might be hard to get used to because it's really kind of like it's the singing equivalent of overacting. Like he's really giving it his all, making the song as bitter and bilious as possible with his harsh vocals. And then you got some ensemble vocals as well, kind of sounding like a children's choir, but it's the band. And that gives it like a disturbing nature as well, because it kind of sounds like it's some kind of, I guess that's the whole point, like a weird twisted nursery rhyme. And especially at the end of the song with those choirs, I guess you can call it a choir, but it's really just the band singing together. Gives it that childish vibe that even adds more to the disturbing nature of the song. And musically, it's fantastic. It's a tale of two halves. The first half of the song is completely different from the second half, and both have their merits. So the first half of the song just starts off with this amazing riff. It's actually a keyboard and guitar riff at the same time, which makes extensive use of Steve Hackett's finger tapping. And then Phil Collins comes in at the precise moment with the doom doom ticka doom doom ticka doom doom ticka, and it almost has like a jolly vibe to it until Peter Gabriel's voice comes crunching in with the turn and run. Nothing can stop them. And it's just really, again, it's just really grating on the ears. And the song gets into this fantastic swing. It's just such a unique song. But before you, like, right when you think the song can't get any more creative, it totally changes at around the 4 minute mark and just becomes this epic piano and guitar driven buildup that just, oh man, builds up to this amazing crescendo, kind of like in the musical box. But it's just, oh man, it's crazy. Just the way the guitar and the keyboard builds up, and it kind of has a classical feel to it. And then there's this like nice atmospheric Steve Hackett guitar solo going over it. They would later try to do this again on the song Ripples from A Trick of the Tail, where the song totally changes at around the 4 minute mark and gets into like this weird instrumental section. But they did it first on the Giant Hogweed, but and they're both equally amazing. But they did it first on this song, which came out years before. So yeah, the ending of this song is just an all-out crescendo with the apocalypse and the keyboards just sounding like you're in the midst of St. John's Revelations. It's incredible. It's a fantastic song, and clocking it at 8 minutes, one of the epics on the album. Again, a song that might be hard to get into at first because of just the sheer contrast with the earlier Genesis work, but it's such a fun song, and it's such a crazy listening experience. So for that reason, it's one of my all-time favorite Genesis songs, and it gets a strong 9.5 out of 10.
The old man's guide is young.
And now, after all that craziness, you flip over the album and you're on side two. And again, the album gives you another break with a nice Mellotron soaked ballad. Because the first song on side two, it's a nice little song called Seven Stones. And yeah, I think this is a really underrated track. And I know that word's subjective because, what I would rate highly, you might not rate as highly. But for me, I really think it's underrated because I've seen so many comments on Prog Archives, people saying that Seven Stones was the weakest song on this album. And to me, I'll never understand that because okay, I'll grant them this. It's not one of the greatest songs on the album, but the two songs that succeed this one are definitely a little bit weaker for me. And it's all subjective because at the end of the day, there really is no weak song on this album. They're all pretty good. But for me, there's no way that I can call this the weakest song. And a lot of people say it's like boring and it just plods along. And I totally disagree because, okay, first of all, I'm a huge Mellotron fan. And if you like Mellotron, let me tell you, this is the song for you. It is just absolutely soaked in Tony Banks's Mellotron. And it just gives it that epic feel. And Peter Gabriel's singing is just incredible on this one. He reaches so many emotional highs. The backup vocals are amazing. And it just feels like an epic song that could have easily been extended to like 10, 15 minutes, but condensed into a nice short 5 minute track. And I don't know, I just think it's a great breather on the album and a fantastic song. So I definitely think it's underrated. I think people should, probably give it another try and just let it take you away because the vocals on this are really strong considering it's Peter Gabriel and I'm saying that's saying something. And lyrically, it's a pretty good song as well. It's about how kind of like a cynical song. The moral, I guess, is that everything just happens by chance. There's no true meaning, and that's personified through this old man, this old hermit who goes around like fooling everyone by pretending to be a fortune teller, but really just shit just ends up happening by chance. Anyway, that's my interpretation of it, but it's a great song, and I'm gonna give it a really strong 9 out of 10 because I really think it deserves it.
The crowd was getting stronger, and the high road getting weaker. Forward, backward, swaying side to side, fearing the very worst. They called his mother to the side.
Now we're getting into track five, and this one here, I have mixed feelings about it. It's called Harold the Barrel, and it's a really short, quirky 3 minute song that was really like trying to go for the humor on this album. And Phil Collins and Peter Gabriel, they share dual vocals on this song, and their vocals are actually synced together, so you can't actually split up the audio track into Peter Gabriel's parts and Phil Collins' part. It just sounds like one vocal. It's a really strange but effective vocal effect, I would say. But yeah, so when I first heard this song back in the day, I thought, what the fuck is this? It's just insane. The vocals are coming at you at like 1,000 kilometers an hour, and it's just this weird song about a restaurant owner who's about to commit suicide, and the whole town is like trying to stop him, which is a really funny idea. And it was definitely like a Phil Collins inspired song because he was really trying to bring the humor into the band and like trying to convince them to not take themselves too seriously. But I don't know, for me, like the vocals on this song never really worked, and like I've alternated between really liking this song and just thinking it's just an okay track. Right now, like I can't speak for myself a few years down the line, but right now I find myself really enjoying the song for what it is, just a nice fun track. And what really keeps this song alive for me is this extremely unexpected tempo change in the middle of the song. It goes from this like jaunty, like quirky tune into this nice like 15-20 second ballad. And it's hilarious because it's so unexpected. And and at this part it's just Peter Gabriel singing alone. And it just sounds great. And it makes me think if they expanded this song into like maybe a 5-6 minute song and let the song breathe, really like expanded that middle section, I think it would have benefited the song. But a lot of fans love it for what it is. A lot of people really, really like this song. So who am I to judge? Maybe that's the charm. It's just a short, quirky tune, and I'm always looking for like these long, progressive epics. But but yeah, really funny tune. And right now I'm digging it, so I'm gonna give it a 7 out of 10.
Always the same, but there appears in the shades of dawn, and though you'll rise again, all of the pieces in the sky.
Coming in at track 6, we got another breather track. Yeah, that's right. This one here, it's a nice come down from the craziness that was Harold the Barrel, and a nice prelude to the closing epic track on this album, The Fountain of Salmacis. And this one here, it's called Harlequin, and it's just, yeah, it's just a short acoustic ballad with ensemble vocals written by Mike Rutherford. And the funny thing is, Mike Rutherford, he really doesn't like this song, and I don't know why. I think it's a really enjoyable track. Sure, a lot of people say it's probably the weak point on the album, and I can't argue with that. It's one of the two tracks that I consider like the lesser ones. But again, at 2 minutes, it's a nice kind of like, I don't want to say a filler track because I don't think it's filler, but it's a nice like breather. And that's what I love about this album. It's just has great pacing. Like whenever you have like an insane epic track, it's followed by like a gentle acoustic ballad, and it just keeps the album fresh and acts as a nice palate cleanser. So yeah, really cool song, and just shows how Genesis was really great at crafting albums in terms of the flow. So yeah, pretty good one. I'm gonna give it a 7.5. And now we're on to the closing epic track. And closing out the album, we have the epic, epic. Did I mention epic? Closing track, The Fountain of Salmacis. And there is just so much going on in this song. There's so much to it, so many layers of complexity. And it's going to be hard to kind of like break it down with words. It's just, honestly, I feel like it's one of their most complex songs. That's right, even more complex than the musical box in terms of time changes and musicianship. And I think for that reason, it is hard to get into at first because it's constantly shifting in tone and mood. And it really takes a lot of listens to really get this song down packed. I mean, the first time I heard it, I believe it was on the radio, believe it or not, our local station, Q107. And at this point, I'd heard very little Genesis, probably just like their hit songs. And then this one came on, and the DJ even said this is an extremely deep track from one of their earliest albums. And I was just blown away. It was just insane because it just goes through so many changes. But what this song is really all about, it could be summarized in one word: Mellotron. And I know I said that about Seven Stones, but the Mellotron on this song is just incredible. I mean, that intro, how it just slowly like swells and swells and swells, and then builds up into this amazing crescendo. It's the perfect accompaniment to the theme of this song, which is the Greek myth of the first hermaphrodite. Basically, how a nymph and a demigod were joined as one into this like mystical being with a cock and a vagina at the same time. I don't know. The Greeks were fucked up, and basically this happened at a place called Salmacis, at this magical spring. And the way the mellotron swells at the beginning and builds up kind of sounds like it's like the musical equivalent of mist just pouring over this valley, and then like when the crescendo builds up, this beautiful spring is revealed and the mist clears. Anyway, that's what comes into my mind. And it's just one of the most beautiful Mellotron intros of all time, one of the most memorable. And Tony Banks was known for this because on their next album, Foxtrot, the very first song that opens the album starts off with this amazing Mellotron intro. And to this day, I still debate which one I like better, this one or the one on the next album. I'd probably give it to the one on the next album, but this one gives it a really, really strong run for its money. but it's not all Mellotron. I mean, there's so much going on. There's an incredible Steve Hackett guitar solo closing out the song. And the funny thing is, this song was not supposed to have a guitar solo, but one night they were in the studio, and Steve Hackett was actually they weren't even in the studio. Where they were in this Victorian countryside home, or not Victorian, but a 16th century home, and that's where they were writing the album. And I think that setting really inspired, the Victorian old school feel of this album. Forgot to mention that earlier, but yeah, so they were writing. Usually they would turn in pretty early. They were pretty good boys, but one night they were drinking and chilling, and Steve Hackett is like, you know what? Inspiration struck, and this amazing guitar solo just popped into his head, and he's like, this would go great at the end of the Fountain of Salmacis, and they just added it in, and it's just a perfect way to close the song, and a fantastic way to close the album. So we talked about like the intro of this song and the outro, but what happens in the middle? Just all kinds of stuff. I mean, this song relies heavily on backup vocals, and I've been praising the backup vocals on this album, but I have to be honest, the backup vocals on this song are kind of distracting because they happen at the same time as basically these ensemble vocals happen at the same time as Peter Gabriel singing, and they're singing two different things at the same time, and it can be quite distracting. And again, like I've heard this song millions of times, so I've gotten used to it. But at first, the contrast between the backup vocals and Peter Gabriel singing was kind of distracting, to be honest. And that's like the only minor criticism I have. Otherwise, this is like a perfect song. And what really pissed me off about that was Peter Gabriel's vocals were just so fucking phenomenal on this song that the backup vocals kind of detracted from that because his vocals are really really strong. I mean, he hits on some really high points, especially the part where Peter Gabriel sings, "Both had given everything they had," and the backup vocals on top of that, oh, just send chills up and down your spine every single time. And oh man, the meat and potatoes of this song are just fantastic. That original Mellotron intro comes back periodically throughout the song and just brings back that like little touch of majesty, that little like that magical touch that Tony Banks has on the keyboard. And there's all kinds of fantastic stuff. I mean, Steve Hackett's on fire throughout the whole song. It's not just that closing solo. He's just going crazy. And there's even this like chunky little bass solo by Mike Rutherford in the middle of the song, which is really unexpected. When you hear that, you're like, damn, this guy has some serious chops. So yeah, another thing I should mention is right before the closing guitar solo, the band is singing ah, and they're singing as a band, and it just feels so majestic, so magical. I guess that's the only way I can describe this song, just majestic and complex. The only thing that detracts from it is during the main verses, the backup vocals they're singing different things at the same time as Peter Gabriel, and that can be slightly distracting. Doesn't really gel that well with the music, but it's just a minor criticism. And trust me, over the years you'll get used to that. But yeah, Fountain of Salmacis, definitely one of their best songs. Probably the second best on the album, or the third best, because Giant Hogweed gives it a good run for its money, and a very strong 9.5 out of 10. So yeah, the album really closes on a very strong note. All right, guys, so that brings us to the end of the review. Now there's only two things left to do: give the album a final rating and sign off. So for this album here, I'm gonna give it an extremely high score, guys, because honestly, it's one of my all-time favorites. It has such a unique atmosphere in the Genesis canon, and it's just their first real it's their first real step towards the excellence that is the next three albums. So yeah, definitely one of my favorites. It's going to be getting a 92.06%. And if you want to see the breakdown of that, just check the description below. It's just a mishmash of like my personal preference for the songs, the lyrics, vocals, creativity, musicianship, just all that shit combined into one. And I'd love to hear your comments down below, your thoughts on the album, maybe like your songs ranked, like all that shit. Just put it in the comment section below, and I'd be happy to read it and respond. So yeah, guys. So when this album came out, and it didn't really take the world by storm. In England, it didn't chart until 1974 when Genesis started picking up in popularity, but it did go to number one in Italy. And when Genesis toured this album, they played to huge, enthusiastic crowds. So again, I'm just proud because my background's Italian. I thought I'd just throw that in there. And yeah, so the album didn't do very well, but artistically, today it's placed at a very high. It's placed on a pedestal today. Like if you look at Prague Archives, I believe this album's in their top 15 of all time, and that's saying something considering all the amazing progressive rock albums. So yeah, guys, thanks so much for joining me again on another lengthy review. The next video in the series is going to be that fucking masterpiece, 1972's Foxtrot, and I'm getting excited just thinking about it. So stay tuned for that one, and thanks so much for watching, guys. Take it easy.